Hello and welcome back to the series. In this and the next video, we will have a look at Flexbox. Flexbox stands for Flexible Box Layout Module. Not the best name maybe, but Flexbox is really awesome because Flexbox allows us to display our elements on our website more dynamically or more flexible. And this is really important, especially nowadays when we have all these different devices which we want to use to access our websites, like laptops, tablets, smartphones, and so on. And because of that, we need a responsive website. And this is what we can do with Flexbox. So let's have a look at that in this and the next video. So as I said, Flexbox is awesome, but first we have to understand some theory behind it, so how it actually works. And it all starts right here with a specific property, because what you want to do is, you want to add the way an element is displayed. And what you do then is, well, you add the property named display to this element. So far, so clear. And we had different values for that. This could be block or inline. Now, if you don't add block or inline, but this one right here, flex, then you change this behavior of this element basically, because you turn the element you added this declaration to into this. You turn this element into a parent or into a flex container. Well, and as the name says, a container normally contains something. And this something are the children or the so-called flex items. And that's the important core concept of Flexbox that you have to understand. Because you always add display flex to your parent element or kind of the wrapping element. And by that, you turn this parent or, as I said, this wrapping element into the flex container. And inside this container, you then have all these different flex items. So the flex items are basically nested elements into this or inside of this parent element. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, as soon as we get this, we can add more properties to our flex container. This could be flex flow, justify content, align content, or align items. We can, of course, also add more properties to our flex items. These properties can be order, flex, or align self. And now at this point, it's probably confusing. Therefore, let's forget about that for a second, so about these properties for the flex items, and talk about these in the next video. And in this video, we will just focus onto the flex container. So how it works, how we can create it, and what happens if we add all these different properties. And with that, we got the basic theory set. And this means we can now jump straight into the code of our example page and see how this all works. So let's have a quick look at the code, which you can, of course, as always, find down there in the video description or a link to the code. And what we can see in the HTML file is basically this div with the class parent. This will become our flex container. You remember back what we saw on the slide a few seconds ago. And inside this div, we have 6 other divs. This will become our flex items. We also saw that before. But we'll talk about the details regarding the different flex items in the next video. In this video, we will only focus onto the properties that we can add to this parent class right here. So talking about properties, let's go to our CSS file right here. And here you can see I just added some basic styling to HTML and body. And here I indicate that we start with Flexbox. And actually, we will only work right here in our parent. So this will be the only rule or rule set we will work with now in this video. And down here, you can see the styling for the different divs. Important, as you can see for div 1, I didn't add any height or width to it. For the second div, I added a width of 150 pixels and a font size. You will see later why this is important, at least for what we want to show right here. Then you can see in the third div that I added a height of 150, so here the width, here the height. In div 4, I added width and height, so both. And div 5 and 6 only has a width of 200 pixels. So that's our basic setup we will work with. But as I said, the focus will be right here in our parent or on our parent. Now, what does this look like on the website? Well, it looks like this basically. Here we have our 6 divs. And as you can see, the content of the div always indicates the height and width property that was applied. So that's the basic setup. I think now it's time to go back to our code and have a look at Flexbox finally. So in the code, we will add display flex right here to our parent element. And that's really important, although I'm repeating myself, but I want to make sure that you really see how this works. This is now becoming our flex container. And all these divs right here, which are nested inside this element, you can see it right here. We have the div class parent as the, well, parent then. And inside this parent, we have all these divs. So flex items, flex container. Keep that in mind. However, we are back right here and we need to save this now. So we just added display flex right there. And if we go back and now reload the page, well, you can see something really interesting, right? Because all our divs, which were, or still are actually, block level elements, are now displayed in one single row. That's really interesting. What is even more interesting is that if I decrease the size, you can see that the width of the elements decreases as far as possible. And as far as possible means up until the point where the content basically needs the space. You can see it right here and right there. If I increase our side, you can see that all the elements are increasing up to the point where they reach their defined maximum. If we inspect that, we can see that now this box has a width of 200. Same is true for here. Here we have 150. Here we have still the initial value, so only the value or the width the content needs. Here we have 150, and here we have the same thing, just the width that the actual content needs. And also important, our parent, so our div with the class parent, is also behaving like a block level element, so it increases and decreases the size depending on our website width. So that's what happens basically when we use display flex. There is more that's happening right here, but we'll have a look at that step by step throughout this video. So let's go back to the code now and change this value from display flex to display inline flex right here. If we save that and go back and reload the page, we can immediately see what happens to our parent. Our parent now behaves like an inline element. This means it doesn't occupy the entire space anymore. Let me maybe unselect the inspect tool here. It only needs the space that is required to display the content. Just a normal inline element behavior basically. More interesting also is that if I decrease the size now, you can see that our elements are not decreasing their width, they just keep their width. And if I decrease the size more, well, you can see that all our elements are basically hidden. So this is what happens if I use the inline flex value for our display property. Now I don't think that's what we want, so let's change it back to flex right here, like that, and save it. So if we go back now, we can see that it behaves like we had it before. This is nice, but that's of course not everything we can do with Flexbox, because with that, we now just defined that this should be our flex container. But of course, now we have lots of possibilities how to change the way these flex items behave. And to see that, we will add another property. And this property is called flex flow, like that. And the standard values, because we will need two values, for the flex flow are row and no wrap. This one right here. Now, why am I adding two values here? Well, the reason is simple. This flex flow property combines two separate properties, which you could also use, but I like to use this combined flex flow property. And which properties are these actually? Well, let me comment this maybe right here. Row simply refers to the flex direction property, and no wrap, so the second value, refers to flex wrap. Well, kind of intuitive actually, like that. As I said, you can also write these two properties separately, but I'll stick to flex flow because I think it's easier to use. However, if we save that and go back and reload our page, we can see that the behavior is exactly the way it was before, because as I said, this is the standard value, or these are the standard values. However, let's change that now and let me start with the second value with no wrap. So let's change the flex wrap property. Because if we have no wrap right here, well, we can also have wrap, of course. If we save that and go back, then we'll see something interesting. Because if you reload the page, you can see, well, nothing happens. That's not really interesting. But if I now decrease the size of the page, can you see it? Now our elements, well, wrap as the name says. And what does wrap mean here? Well, it basically simply wraps as soon as you reach the point where it would have to reduce the width of our items. As you can see, it keeps the 200 width of our width 200 pixels items down there. If I wrap that further, you can see that it keeps that width, and then comes finally the point where it decreases the size of these elements. As you can see, it cannot decrease that size right here because the content simply occupies that space. But that's basically how wrap works. And there is also another important thing that you might see already, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. You can also see that if you look at the last two elements, you can see that now the height of this element decreased significantly, because right here we have a height of 150 pixels, although we didn't define any height. But for this element now, when it's wrapped, it only has the height of 18.5 pixels, so the value it needs to display the content. And that's also something really interesting, but this is also something that we can change. But as I said, we'll talk about that in a few seconds. The main thing that changed now is that adding wrap as a value for the flex wrap property allows us to, well, let our items wrap. We also have another option right here. We can also use, you can see it already, wrap reverse. If we use that and go back and reload the page, like this, we can see that if we now decrease the size, it wraps, well, reverse, as the name says. Now our two elements right here are on top, and div1 right here is at the bottom. Also something you can use just by simply changing the value that we have right here. However, I will stick to wrap because I think that's the more intuitive and maybe normal way that you would expect to happen to your elements if you want to wrap it. However, we also have this one, flex direction, so this value right there. And the standard value is row, but as you can imagine, you could also change that to column right here. If we save that and go back to our page and reload it, whoa, then we see actually a lot of interesting things. Because the main thing, of course, is that now it is displayed as a column again, or the elements are displayed in a column again, and this is more the behavior we know from the normal block level elements. And if I decrease the width, you can see it behaves just like we saw it before, but right here, the elements don't become smaller than the width that we defined. So basically, not only the way it is displayed changed, but also the behavior changed. Now that's interesting, and also something we'll have a look at in the next minutes. But there is more things we can change right here. If we go back and change it from column to row, reverse for example, and save that, and go back and reload the page, we can now see that if we increase our page, we have the same behavior we saw in the beginning with row, but now from a reverse perspective. So that's also possible. And as you can see, if we decrease the size, you can see that our elements decrease until they reach the minimum width they need for the content. Let's increase that, or let's maybe keep it like that, like this. And let's now change it to, as you can imagine, column reverse, like that. And let's go back and reload the page. And as you can see, now it is displayed differently again. Now we see div one right here, and the elements are basically aligned to the left here. And if I decrease the size, you can see that again, the width of the element stays the way it was defined initially. Now, this can be really confusing, so this whole row, column, reverse row thing. And there is also a really important aspect included into that you have to understand to make sure that you can use Flexbox correctly. And because of that, it's now time to go back to theory again to understand what actually happened here. Because the main thing you have to understand right here is main axis versus cross axis. And now it gets even more confusing, but let's have a look at it step by step. So first we have this thing right here. This is basically our website, or to be more precise, this is our Flex container. Now, what we did, we added flex direction. You remember flex flow, the first value, this is the flex direction property. Now we added a value of row in the beginning. This was the default value that we had. What does this mean for our container, for our Flex container? Well, this basically means that the main axis goes from the top left corner to the right, as indicated by the arrow. That's the main axis. Just keep that in mind. And if we have a main axis, then we also have a cross axis. And the cross axis starts at the same position as the main axis, but still goes downwards, of course. So that's the basic setup we saw in the beginning. Now we can also change that, because we saw that we didn't only have row, we also had row reverse. Now what does this mean? Well, row reverse simply means this right here. Our main axis now starts in the right top corner, because if the normal row is from left to right, from the top left to the top right, then row reverse, well, this should be from the top right to the top left corner of our Flex container. So this is the main axis then, and this is the cross axis. So this is what happens between row and row reverse. Let's go back to the code and try this out once again to make sure we understand that. So back in the code, now we will add row once again, like this. Go back and increase the size maybe, like this, and reload the page. So we know that we now set our flex flow to row, and so the main axis starts right here in the top left corner and goes from left to right. The cross axis then goes from top to bottom. You cannot see that right here, but that's just what it is. Now if we change it, if we go back and change it to row reverse, save that and go back again, you can see that now diff1 starts right here in the right top corner. So it goes from right to left right here, and the cross axis goes down here. And if you don't believe me with the cross axis, we can simply decrease the size or the width here, as you can see it, like that. And as you can see, the elements start right here, and they are all aligned to the right basically, so to the cross axis. If we go back and change it back to row, right here, oops, sorry, without the E, and go back again and reload the page, now everything is aligned right here to the left basically, because now our cross axis starts in the top left corner. So that's the first thing, that's row versus row reverse. Let's increase the size, or let's maybe keep it like that, because if we now go back to our slide and now have a look at two more examples, and the first one is this right here, we have the flex direction of column now. Can you imagine what happens then to our two axes that we have? I hope you can, maybe you can't, no problem, because what happens now is that our main axis now goes from the top left corner to the bottom, so not anymore from the top left corner to the right, because we changed the way, or we change our two axes with that column value. And if the main axis goes from top left to bottom, then the cross axis has to go from the top left to the right. Now, if we continue that and think about that from one last perspective, this would be flex direction column reverse. Can you imagine now what happens? Well, maybe you can, because what simply happens now is that column reverse simply goes from the bottom left corner, because remember, with column, we started in the top left corner and went to the bottom left corner, and column reverse then, well, this means that the cross axis has to start in the bottom left corner and go up to the top left corner again. And this also means that our starting point for these two axes is now the bottom left corner, and therefore the cross axis will also start there. So this is basically what you have to keep in mind. And the easiest thing to remember that is actually that the starting point, so the initial starting point for the standard value, which is row, is the top left corner of your flex container. So if you add a value of row, you start right there with the main axis going from left to right. If you take row reverse, you still stay in the top corner, but then you start reverse. So you start in the right top corner. If you define column as a value, well, the starting point is still the top left corner, but now your main axis doesn't go to the right, but it goes down. And finally, if you have a value of column reverse, well, then your starting point initially is the top left corner, but as you have reverse, you just have to go down to the bottom left corner and then go up again to define the main axis. So then the bottom left corner is your starting point. So as I said, try to keep that schema in mind because it helps you a lot to understand how Flexbox actually works. And if you now go back to our code and now change row to column, like that, and go back and reload the page, you can see that our items now behave differently. And if we change it to column reverse, right here, like that, then you can see that it starts in the bottom left corner, as I showed you, and goes up to the top. So that's basically this core concept behind the flex direction. And this is really important because the direction or the position of the main and cross axis has a lot of impact or consequences for other properties that we can use. For example, if we have a look at our website again and change it back to column, right here, like that. If I reload that, you can see that basically the width, the maximum width right here, simply ends at 150, 150, 200, 200. We saw that already. But if I change it now to row, right there, and reload the page, and increase the size, you can see that the height of all our elements is kind of, well, stretched to fit the entire Flex container. And this behavior can be changed, of course. And to understand this behavior, we need more properties, and we need to understand what we just saw about the main axis and the cross axis. So let's have a look at these properties now. Because the properties we can add or will add are the following ones. It's align items and it's justify content. So 2 more properties. Now what does this mean? What are these properties doing? Let's have a look at it in an example. Because the standard value for align items is this one, stretch. So if we save that and go back and reload the page, we can see that nothing is happening. But if I go back now and change stretch to center, save that, go back, then you can see something interesting. Because right now, the height of these elements is just the height that is required to display the content. So it's not, well, as the value said, stretched to the maximum anymore. So align items seems to have an impact onto the height of our elements. And I must say that this is totally wrong. So don't remember that. I just said that because this is what you could see right here. Because if I simply change now our flex flow from row to column, right here to column, and reload the page, can you see what happens? It's not the impact onto the height as you might have thought. It now has an impact onto the way our elements are displayed on our website regarding the position. And in this case, it's the sender position. And why is it then not referring to the height, as I just said that this would be wrong? Because align items only refers to the position of our items relating to the cross axis. You remember? The cross axis now goes from left to right because we defined a flex direction of column. So this means our main axis goes down here and the cross axis goes right here from left to right. And we defined a value for align items, so you can remember that as align items along of the cross axis of sender. This means if I now change that value to flex start, for example, and save that, and go back right here, then it's aligned to the right. Because you remember, our starting point is right here in the top left corner. We have the main axis going down right there, but that doesn't have an impact for align items. And we have our cross axis starting right here, so this is the starting point. And flex start simply means, okay, position the items right here at the beginning of our cross axis mainly. Now, if we go back and change flex flow from column to row once again, and save that and reload the page, then the behavior changes again. Because now our main axis starts right here, from here to here, from left to right. And our cross axis goes from top to bottom, right there. And this means the cross axis starts right here. So the starting point is right there at this part. This means if I change align items back again to center, like that, and save it, then we are centered because again, starting point of the cross axis, end point of the cross axis, center of the cross axis. This is basically what align items do. So keep in mind, align items refers to the cross-axis. That's really important. Now you might say, okay, I got that. I understand that the position of the cross-axis changes depending on the flex direction, and that we can change the behavior of the items in relation or in the direction of the cross-axis with align items. But what about the main axis then? Good question, actually. And the main axis can, of course, also be changed, or the behavior of the items in relation to the main axis. And this can be done with justify content right here. Because if we now add justify content center, for example, right here, and save that, go back, we can see that our items are now centered, if you can see that, a little bit more maybe, are now centered along the main axis. Again, keep in mind, flex direction is row, main axis goes from left to right, and justify content refers to the positioning of the items along our main axis. So if I now change center to flex start, or flex end maybe, would be smarter I think, like that. And if we go back and reload the page, you can see that now our items, I cannot increase it anymore, sorry, but you can now see that our items are now positioned at the end of our main axis. And if we now add another thing, if we now add a height for our flex container of, I don't know, maybe 600 pixels, like that, and reload the page, well, maybe that's too big. I'm sorry, let's make 500 maybe. I think then we can see it better. Yeah, then you can see it better maybe, because if I decrease the size, or let's keep it like that. And if I now write flex start right here for align items and go back, you can see that now align items, so the positioning along the cross axis, so here to here, is start, so at the beginning. And the position of our items in relation to the main axis, so left to right in our case, is now flex end. This is defined by justify content. You can see it ends right here. We have a gap in the beginning, and justify content just says that. Now, if we set both to center, for example, again, like this and like that, then we can see that the entire content is basically centered and looks like that. So this is what it basically looks like, and I know that this can be kind of abstract in the beginning. Therefore, let's have a quick look at a slide that summarizes kind of what we saw right here in this practical example. Because basically what happened now, or what we talked about now, is the following. We have the flex direction of row set, for example. This means we have our website, and on our website we have the main axis, starting in the top left corner, we talked about that, and the cross axis also starting in the top left corner, but going from top to bottom. We saw that and we know that already. What happens now with justify content and align items is the following. With justify content, we define the position of the elements along our main axis in this case. And if this defines the main axis, well, align items simply defines the position along the cross axis. This is what we just saw in this example. Now, if we think back about that from the flex direction column perspective, it slightly changes because our website looks like that. And we now have the cross axis going from left to right. That's a difference, you remember, because now we have the flex direction column defined. And this means the main axis goes from top to bottom. And this also has an impact onto our align items and onto our justify content property. Because align items now refers to the cross axis, but from left to right, so how these items are positioned there. And justify content refers to the main axis again, but now this is referring from the top and bottom positioning basically right there. So maybe also keep that in mind whenever you're confused what happens now regarding align items or justify content. And this is actually it regarding these two properties. Now you might ask yourself, okay, I understood these properties, but which values can I apply right here? How can I play around with these different values? And a good source for that is, as quite often actually, the MDN. the Mozilla Developer Network. If you look right here onto this page, you can find a link to it down there in the video description also. So if you scroll down a bit, you can find some general information about Flexbox right here. But if you scroll down, you can find all the different properties you have right here. And in our case, we used align items, for example. And if you click onto that, you can see all the different values you can use for align items. Now, as you can imagine, these are too much values to have a look at them throughout this video. Therefore, you can just play around with them now because you have the theoretical background. And there are also interesting ones, for example, baseline. Let's maybe try this one out quickly. Because if we add baseline right here as a value and save that and go back and reload the page, you can see that now, I hope it becomes clear right here, that the items are now aligned based on their content. So as you can see, this is one line. This is, for example, what baseline is doing. Maybe not the result you want to have right here. I just wanted to show you that how this works. Now we are almost done with the properties or with the core properties that we can use for our Flex container. But there is one more interesting thing that I would like to show you. And this thing is called align content. Now you might say, okay, we got align items, we got justify content. What is that now? Well, let's maybe start with our center value again, because we know that already. If we save that and go back, well, we can see that it centers now, but this has nothing to do with this new value. Let me maybe undo it and save it. As you can see, this is not related to that. But if I add center once again, like that, and reload the page, and if I decrease the size of our website, you can already see what happens. Because with align content, we can define what happens with extra space that we have in relation to our cross axis. So from top to bottom. If I go back right here and delete that, save it, you can see that it is displayed like that, so we need more space. By adding center, we say, well, as the name says, just center my items right here, so it uses just the space right here. And if I now change that, for example, to a value like space between, like this, for example, and go back and reload the page, you can see that, well, as the name says, there is a space between the first line and the second line. Really important for the property, it only works if you have more than one line, because if I increase the size now, like this, you can see that it basically doesn't have any effect right here onto the way our elements are displayed. For example, if I use flex start right here to show you that and save it and go back and reload the page, you can see nothing changes. But if I decrease the size, you can see that our items are now displayed, well, at the beginning of our cross axis right here. And this is it actually. This is the first part of our Flexbox video series here. I know that this can be quite confusing in the beginning, but if you keep in mind what you can do with flex direction, so basically change the starting point of your Flex container and by that the starting point and the direction of your main axis and of your cross axis. And if you then keep in mind what happens to align items, so align items always refers to the positioning of your flex items along the cross axis. I cannot say like this like that because it depends, but you know what I mean. It's always related to the cross axis. Then you have justify content, which always refers to the positioning of your items along the main axis. And then you have align content, which always refers to the cross axis, but only in cases where you have items in more than one line. So I hope with these examples and with this background knowledge, you are now ready to start with Flexbox and maybe use the code you can find right here, as I said, attached to the video, or the link is attached to the video, to play around and to practice that. Also use the MDN and play around with the different values you can apply to your properties. Because in the end, Flexbox is really awesome, it's really helpful, and actually quite intuitive to use if you got the basic concept. However, this was just part 1, as I said, because we now only applied properties to our Flex container. But inside the Flex container, we have all these different items, And so far, everything we changed affected all of the items. But what if you want to be more precise? What if you want to make sure that specific items inside your Flex container behave the way you want? Well, then you also need to apply some properties to these items. And we'll have a look at that in the next video of the series. So I hope to see you there. And as always, I can only say thanks a lot for watching. Hope to see you in the next video and bye.